The Olympic Games should be abolished.
I'll negate.
Because the Olympic Games are no longer necessary and are burden to many host countries, I strongly affirm a resolution that states resolved, the Olympic Games should be abolished. I have one main contention on why the Olympic Games are bad for society as a whole, which is that the Olympic Games have drained countries of necessary resources. We look to the Olympic Games, not only are they burden on many of the individuals that attend them, but more importantly, they drain necessary resources from the country themselves. Institute for Policy's research finds in 2017 that almost every single Olympic Games thus far have devastated the host countries. This is because the host countries now have to allocate millions of dollars that should have went to improving the community. Business Insider furthers this in 2017 when looking at Rio, where Rio had to spend nearly $10 billion extra on actually making the Olympic project afloat in times for the Games. As a result, there were devastating impacts in Rio. Not only were communities cleared and deforestation occurred at a massive rate, but more importantly, money that was supposed to be going into hands of helping the impoverished was taken away right from them, thus to have international glory. However, we must look to the fact that Rio did not stop at just that. Because there was a massive presence of animals in Rio where the games were supposed to be hosted, Rio themselves and the government themselves had engaged in nearly an extermination and even the extinction of many animals in that region also. And that's why we've seen that more and more countries are becoming more hesitant to host the Olympic Games. While in theory, the Olympic Games are an international recognition of glory and of sports, we should see the devastating impacts they have on the host countries themselves. Thank
you. Is the terminal impact towards your first argument the economic damage to the country / poverty reduction?
Yeah, so we say that because a lot of these, well, it's basically that it leads to deforestation in Rio. It led to animals going extinct. But more importantly, even if you want to look outside of Rio, it actually results in an increase in poverty.
What should be prioritized between animals extinctions and human poverty, in your opinion?
I mean, both should be prioritized, but if we have to pick one, it would be human poverty.
Okay. You argue that there's 10 billion extra that costs to maintain it. How long term are these costs? Do they happen only during the year the country hosts that, or do they last after the country finishes hosting?
I mean, after the country finishes hosting, in a lot of scenarios, that entire section of the city gets abandoned. We've seen this in time and time again throughout history. When Olympic Games were hosted, entire cities were abandoned and entire towns were abandoned around them, meaning that it actually created a lot of wastage and property was never used again.
We negate argument 1. National programs are unified by the Olympics. Countries have an objective to work towards, and when they see a international competition hosted at a different country, they can improve their own individual programs and are better able to work towards goals, unifying the entire country for pursuit of an international goal. So this is pretty important because once countries are unified, they can work better together on economic objectives. They have a sense of national pride, one that allows them to work better with their countrymen and women, which is much more effective at improving the national cohesiveness of that country. And this impacts the economy because they are better able to work with each other and can better form connections within the country. B, impacts towards decreased internal political unrest. When countries are unified together, they have less turnover in politics and are thus able to improve more stable foundations for things like foreign investment, which want to invest in countries that are unified, not ones that have constant internal turmoil. This outweighs on scope because we're affecting every single country around the world who is then and has an objective to get to the Olympics. Individual countries might be harmed by the Olympics. The overall world is better off. The second argument is that the economy of host countries has improved. A couple of reasons. One, tourism goes up. People attend the Olympics to go there. Athletes need to fly in, and their coach and tour have to come along with them as well. Two, infrastructure investment uniquely boosts economic growth because you employ underemployed workers, especially in low-income areas who wouldn't have jobs otherwise, and you use underutilized resources, improving the use of economic productivity in that country. Three, investment is necessary for countries to happen, and other countries would send foreign investment into that country to allow the construction of different facilities for the Olympics to be hosted. And four, exports increase because countries want to increase their connections with countries that are now on the international prestigious stage of the Olympics, which the Rose of 11 in the Economic Journal quantifies countries hosting Olympics increase their exports by 20%. This improves all these four improve the economic growth of a country internally. Economic growth is crucial because it increases job opportunities, decreases prices for people, and overall lifts a rising tide lifts all boats for people within that country. And thus, the economist concludes every 1% increase in economic growth decreases poverty in the country by 9%, and prefer over their arguments because this is not just happening in individual places in that one city that the Olympics host, but rather in the entire country as a whole. Even on a country-wide level, we are outweighing in scope because we affect every single person in that country whose economic growth as a whole is boosted in the aggregate, not individually within a city.
So you talk about this idea of exports increasing in countries that hosted these Olympic Games. How long-term was this?
I believe it lasted several years after the Olympic Games finished hosting, and our points separate from that, i.e. infrastructure development investment, are in the long term as well, which uniquely boost exports regardless of if the country is hosting Olympics at the time or
Right.
not.
So you also talk about this idea of increased infrastructure. If a lot of times that infrastructure is abandoned, does it actually have any proper impacts on the region?
Yes, the construction process for the infrastructure are economic
It's
benefits regardless of the
abandoned. How
infrastructure
does
is
it
used.
help a nation?
Because of the construction process of that infrastructure, which our point talked about. We're not just saying we build a nice road and that helps growth. We're saying that the process of building that road employs people who wouldn't have been employed otherwise, giving them money to put
Why
back into the
shouldn't we
economy.
build roads in areas that need it more? Why should it be used towards a temporary project that gets abandoned after a year?
Those temporary projects are good things in general because they allow for infrastructure construction. Funds would not have been allocated towards those places absent the existence of the Olympics. We have the only risk of the use of those funds, regardless of if the Olympics are used well in the future.
Let's start off with my opponent's first contention where he talks about this idea of unification. Now, there's two main responses. First, we need to look to the Washington Post, where they say in 2016 that because the Olympic Games actually created unrest in region, there was actually political instability right after the Olympic Games actually ended. So this idea of it creating a cohesive nation is exactly false. That actually leads to a worse quality of life for everyone in the region. But even if you don't believe that, let's look to the New York Times in 2016 that they saw that this political unrest after the following of the Olympic Games actually led to a slower economy in Rio. We've seen this in almost every single nation. Even if you don't want to look in Rio, that's because the Olympics takes away necessary resources that the nation could have used in other areas, such as helping impoverished communities, and it allocates towards them towards a project that gets abandoned only a year later. Now let's move on to his second contention where he talks about the economy. Now there's four main responses. First, he needs to realize that a lot of this infrastructure that gets built is often abandoned a year after. So even if he's talking about this infrastructure creating benefits in the region, it only creates temporary benefits. And a lot of times it actually creates a harm because now money is used towards an abandoned project. But secondly, he talks about this idea of foreign investment. He needs to prove how often foreign investment goes into the region. And we see in the case of Rio that foreign investment actually didn't happen that often. And the people actually supported the burden of the $10 billion extra that the project actually costed. Third, we need to look to the idea that he talks about how these exports increase in the region. We can see that the exports don't actually increase in the region long term. Long term, these nations actually suffer economically because of the political unrest, but more importantly, because you're taking resources away from the people themselves because the taxpayers now have to pay for this. Now, fourth of all, you need to realize that long term, money was taken from the region in every single scenario. You need to look to the Business Insider where they talked about in Rio where the project actually costed $10 billion extra. So in the long term, the economy does actually suffer. Even in the short term, there might be an increase in tourism. In the long term, you devastate the region and you devastate the people who live there.
On our C1 about the unification of countries, their first response says there's unrest in the regions that host the Olympics. Sure, when regions host the Olympics, not the entire world, which has much more national unity compared to the individual country that is hurt somewhat. Two, they say the New York Times, they slowed the economy in Rio. Sure, slowed in Rio, not Brazil, which the UN finds actually improved the economy overall. So even if the individual city that hosts the Olympics is hurt, the entire country as a whole is helped, which is the way that we do in our second contention that they drop. In our second point about the economy being improved, they say one, infrastructure is abandoned. Sure, it doesn't matter. We still give money towards people in their pockets, improving the local economic growth, which overall allows them to reinvest into that economy, boosting growth regardless of if the project is used or not. Two, they say people supported the burden. Sure, people supported some of the burden. That didn't stop more investment coming into the country that wouldn't have come in otherwise. Three, they say exports don't matter because they still suffer economically. This is just repeating their point, which does not respond to the idea that countries need to send more exports to countries that are now elevated towards international prestige thanks to the Olympics, which is why Rose finds that hosting increases trade 20%. Finally, to say money is taken, again, just repeating their points without interacting with ours. Money may be taken locally without, but that entire country gets economic growth with the economist finds every 1% decrease of poverty 0.9%. So we're clearly winning our point, and they've conceded the winning on it. Let's go to their point, because even their point only matters if the individual city is hurt, but it doesn't matter if the entire country as a whole is benefited, regardless of that individual city. Like, sure, there might be a negative impact there, but it's much less significant than the entire country being helped. Two, they also concede that even if there's some decrease in the amount of revenue that city could spend, the entire pie as a whole grows. Money may be allocated towards that city, but they never prove it would be allocated otherwise towards beneficial programs. In fact, we point out that through increased tourism, infrastructure investment, foreign investment, and exports, you gain more money overall for the country to use. 10 billion might be spent there, you gain 20 billion otherwise. And three, people don't need the government anymore. You might concede that 10 billion of those dollars don't go towards helping the people. They don't need them when economic growth is better. They have better jobs, higher wages, and lower prices. No need to rely on the government to pay them next to 10 billion at the end. Finally, they say there's deforestation and decreased extinction. However, they concede in Crossfire that we should prioritize human poverty, which we are winning the cleanest link into. Their arguments could all be true that we hurt the local economies. The global economy and the regional economies are all benefited when the country hosts the Olympics because they get more investment for the country as a whole, not just one small city.
Truly understand the effects of the Olympic Games on a city, we must look to the one main voter issue, which is the effects and the after effects, especially. My opponent comes up here and time to time says that the short-term effects are beneficial. And while I concede to this, we must look to the long term, because in the long term, we see that the majority of these cities suffer. When we look to USDA in 2020, they saw that the exports in Rio actually went down in the region after they actually had the Olympic Games. In 2020, they actually had lower exports than they had in 2015 before hosting the Games. That's important because it shows that the economic region in Rio actually suffered because of the Olympic Games, because now the people are suffering because they had to invest into a project that was only temporary, that to invest into infrastructure that was abandoned within the year. Now we need to realize that a lot of this money would have been used in the region to improve the region. The Rio government themselves was willing to put that money, but they actually had to take it from taxpayers and prevented proper investment in the region. That's why you must affirm.
The Olympic Games function as elevating countries to the international stage allows for increased exports. Specifically, the Rose evidence that they've dropped in every speech says the hosting the Olympics increases trade 20%. They bring up a new card saying exports in Rio went down. Sure, we agree that in the individual city the Olympics are hosted in, exports, economic growth, all that might decrease. But that's good because for the country as a whole, not just every one city in Rio, but all these cities in Brazil, they all improve regardless, which is why they can see the UN evidence saying that Brazil's economy improved even if Rio's economy suffered. So that's the first piece of wing that they've completely conceded, that we can believe their points entirely, that Rio was hurt, but the entire country was helped, outweighing them on scope. The other argument they drop is that when we improve trade, we give the government more revenue, we give the people more revenue, and increase economic growth. What the economist finds, every 0.1% increase in growth decreases poverty 0.9%, which is more important because even if the government isn't spending all that money they spent on the Olympics on the people, they don't need it anymore because they have better jobs, better wages, and lower prices for what they need. Which is why overall, if we win our points that the economy improves, we don't need to win that the government spends money on the people. In fact, neither of the points are necessary so long as we can prove the entire country is helped as a whole, decreasing poverty and increasing growth.